Hello everyone, and good afternoon or morning, depending upon what part of the country you're joining us from. Welcome to NCPERS 2021 Legislative Conference webcast. We have 2 hours together today, and I'm excited about the agenda we have set for you. However, before we begin, I want to take a moment to reflect on and acknowledge the extraordinary year we've all had. 15 months ago, more than 200 of us gathered in Washington for our legislative conference. We could not have known it at the time, but that program would be our last in-person meeting. Since then, we've all adjusted and adapted. We've gotten used to Zoom calls and continue to meet our educational needs remotely. As we virtually assemble today, we have so much reason for optimism. Across America, nearly 200 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered. Nearly half of all Americans over the age of 18 have received at least one dose, and 30% are fully vaccinated. Although the loss of life has been tragic and profound, the progress against this disease has been swift and impressive. We all sense the possibility of a return to normalcy, although the new normal will probably involve distancing and masks for a while. As progress continues, we are hopeful that we will be able to meet in person again soon, maybe even as soon as this summer. We are grateful for all of our members for their continued support of our organization during these trying times. Because even though COVID-19 has slowed the world to a crawl, public pensions haven't stopped, not even for a moment. Teachers, firefighters, and other public servants continue to be hired and retire. And in between those big life events, they pay into their pension systems. As public pension plans, we have a noble mission. Our job is to help millions of American public servants have a dignified retirement with a predictable stream of income in the form of a defined benefit pension. The instability that has rocked our nation over the past year has clearly demonstrated the value of a reliable, steady income in retirement. We will never stop advocating for workers who have earned the right to a pension. And we're not talking about a small number of workers either, not by a long shot. As of March of this year, 18.6 million people work for state and local governments, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Added up, and that works out to about 1 in 8 U.S. workers, most of whom are eligible for public pensions. The sheer size of our community makes public pensions a force to be reckoned with when we engage in the policy arena. Advocacy has always been critical to our mission, and in that respect, nothing has changed. We continue to face cross-currents and opposing pressures. A new administration has arrived in Washington, and on balance, it's more sympathetic to public pensions than the last. However, the past year has jolted the economy and the workplace. State and local governments have taken a bruising. In many places, business closures and layoffs have hit tax revenue. As a result, we can expect to continue pressure on public pension plans to justify and defend the benefits earned by our retirees. Our advocacy must include speaking up for federal initiatives to provide support to state and local governments and drive investments in infrastructure. Speaking of advocacy, we know what responsible advocacy looks like and what it does not look like. All Americans have the right to petition their government for the redress of grievances and to make their voices heard. Unfortunately, on January 6th, we saw our U.S. Capitol under siege by a violent and seditious mob. In no way is that a legal or appropriate way to exercise one's First Amendment right. When we advocate for ourselves on Capitol Hill or in state houses, we do so respectfully and responsibly. We change minds by offering facts and speaking from experience. What we are doing here today, sharing our knowledge, arming ourselves with facts, and marshaling our arguments, this is the right way to speak up. Pensions have a powerful story to tell. For more than 150 years, public pension systems have demonstrated that the long-term strategy of investing to provide income in retirement works. We stick to our mission in good times and bad, investing steadily and prudently to fulfill the promises made to millions of public employees. In the couple hours we have, we're going to take a deep dive into several topics that matter to our pension community. Both familiar and new faces will join us today. First up, we will hear from our honored guest, Representative Rodney Davis, the Illinois Republican, who has proposals to repeal the windfall elimination provision, or WEP, and the government pension offset, GPO. Next, we are fortunate to welcome Kara Getz, Chief Counsel of the House Ways and Means Committee, who will provide an overview of the committee's retirement agenda. Then, our good friend Tony Rhoda from the law firm of Williams & Jensen will walk us through the NCPERS federal policy agenda for 2021. In the second half of our agenda, we kick off with Angela Antonelli of Georgetown University, who will update us on the push to expand retirement options for private sector employees. The secure choice model has taken root in states and cities across America, so we're anxious to hear the latest developments. The Honorable Cedric Richmond, Senior Advisor to President Biden and Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement, will be here to outline the administration's agenda. Finally, we will conclude the day by honoring Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio and Chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, as our policymaker of the year for 2020. The work we begin here today is critical because so is our mission. Together, we are enabling Americans to reap the rewards of their years of work. We hope everyone will come away with a renewed sense of purpose and feel informed and empowered to speak out to your senators and representatives in Washington and in your home states. Thank you for being here today, and let's get this program started. As I mentioned, we'll start with Representative Rodney Davis. The Honorable Rodney Davis is currently serving his fourth term in Congress, serving the 13th District of Illinois, a district covering both urban and rural areas of central and southwestern Illinois. Representative Davis serves on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Additionally, he is the ranking member on the Committee on House Administration, a committee responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operation of the U.S. House of Representatives and the federal elections. Representative Rodney also serves on the Committee on Agriculture, where he continues to focus on issues important to Illinois farmers and helping people get out of poverty and into good-paying jobs. During his time in Congress, Mr. Davis has distinguished himself as an effective lawmaker who is able to work with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass legislation. Please join me in welcoming Representative Rodney Davis.
Hi, this is Rodney Davis, member of Congress from Central Illinois and a longtime advocate for both the WEP and GPO repeal. Before being elected to Congress back in 2012, I worked for former Congressman John Shimkus for 16 years. As a staffer for John and as a member today, I continue to hear from constituents who are or who have been public employees, and the number one issue that they talk about is the windfall elimination provision and government pension offset of Social Security. Through my years talking to people back in Illinois about these issues, I've realized the damage these policies cause, and they cause so many of our public employees, our teachers, our police officers, firefighters, and more. Because of this, the first bill I introduced after being elected in 2012 was the Social Security Fairness Act, legislation to completely repeal both the WEP and the GPO. Now, I'm proud to say I've introduced this bill every single Congress since then. Organizations like yours are key to helping us build a strong coalition of supporters, co-sponsors, and advocates, because this legislation is something that we can finally put enough pressure on, I hope, with your help, on congressional leadership to bring to the House floor for a vote. None of you asked to be penalized by this unfair policy, and that's why I am so passionate to pass this bill. While some of my colleagues have their own ideas about incremental and temporary fixes, there's only one bill in Congress that would completely repeal both the WEP and GPO, and that's my bill, H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness Act. Last Congress, we had over 260 co-sponsors, the most in over 10 years, and we look forward to garnering even more support for the 117th. I'm eager to work with each of you to ensure that you receive the Social Security benefits you've earned. We cannot do this without you. Continue educating your own members of Congress on the issue, and we will continue gaining co-sponsors. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I appreciate your support in moving this bill forward.
Thank you, Representative Davis. Thank you for your support for these important issues, and thank you for your leadership with your legislation. Now, as members of NCPERS knows, while NCPERS has not taken formal position on WEP and GPO repeal or reform, we do follow it very, very closely because, as Representative Rodney Davis has said, this is a major issue for our constituencies and our retirees. I think many of our retirees go into retirement thinking that they're going to get their full Social Security benefit, and then they get a very unpleasant surprise as they start getting counseling from their pension plans and from Social Security Administration. So we certainly appreciate Representative Davis's leadership and efforts in this effort. However, unfortunately, Representative Davis does not sit on the committee that has jurisdiction over this issue, which is the Ways and Means Committee. Social Security is part of the plethora of portfolios that the Ways and Means Committee has jurisdiction over. And our next speaker will certainly talk about the broader agenda of the Ways and Means Committee relative to retirement, but her boss also has a bill in Congress or a proposal that seeks to modify the WEP elimination as well. So with that, let me introduce our next speaker. Kara Getz is counselor to the chairman for the Ways and Means Committee, working for Chairman Richie E. Neal. Prior to joining Ways and Means, Kara was senior tax counsel for the Senate Finance Committee and tax counsel and legislative director for Congressman Richard Neal. Kara worked as chief counsel for Senate Special Committee on Aging and tax counsel for Senator Gordon Smith. Her private sector experience includes working as director of congressional affairs for ASPA, and as senior manager in the National Compensation and Benefits Group of Ernst & Young. Kara, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to your conversation and remarks.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. Today I'm just speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of any of our members or the chairman. And I figured I'd give a quick overview in terms of what we're doing in the committee. And I will actually, maybe I'll start so I don't forget talking about the WEP, but the way we break up our portfolios, I handle the private retirement work, and my colleagues on the Social Security Subcommittee handle the Social Security work, but they were kind enough to give me a few talking points on the WEP issue, knowing that that's important to you folks. And basically, the chairman has been long committed to getting relief for the millions of public servants in Massachusetts and around the country who are affected by Social Security's WEP. Earlier this month, he introduced H.R. 2337, the Public Servants Protection and Fairness Act of 2021, to fix the WEP for future retirees and provide meaningful relief to current WEP retirees. NCPERS endorsed the chairman's bill in the 116th Congress, and we hope you're able to do so again this year. So wanted to at least highlight the chairman's longtime interest in this issue and leadership in terms of trying to address the WEP issue. But the remainder of my comments will be focused on the private retirement side. I thought I'd start, even though we did it, it's kind of the past, but it's been something that certainly my entire career on the Hill, pretty much, we've been focused on is addressing multi-employer pension underfunding. For many of these plans, as many of you I'm sure are aware of, multi-employer pensions are union pensions. And unfortunately, a small but significant number of those pensions became terribly underfunded by no fault of anyone really, except for things happening, deregulation within industry, and things along those lines. Certainly, the 2008 financial crisis didn't help the situation, and so we did have the situation where you had a lot of these plans that were terribly underfunded. Unfortunately, the BBGC itself, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, who insures these are private sector plans, was also projected to be going insolvent in the short term because so many of these plans were going to them. So they were going to run out of money. And even if they were able to provide benefits, on the multi-employer side, the benefit guarantee is very, very small. So this has been an issue that we've been working on for some time. And fortunately, in the last COVID package, we were able to provide some relief to these plans, essentially providing funding to allow these plans to remain solvent at least for 30 years. So kind of a temporary fix for 30 years, just to ensure that these folks didn't lose their benefits. So I did want to highlight it. It's a huge accomplishment for all of us. It's always been a bipartisan issue. This isn't, a blue state or a red state issue. In fact, if anything, many of these folks are, maybe even the majority, are located in red states. But it was just addressing an issue that I'm sure all of you can relate to, that it was ensuring that these retirees were able to maintain their pensions. They certainly didn't do anything wrong. They, when they were in their 20s and 30s, said, I'm not going to take my compensation now. I'm instead going to put it in a pension. And then here we are when they're in their 70s and 80s, and all of a sudden their plans, are blowing up, and they were really at risk of having some benefit cuts. And so I know the chairman is very proud of that achievement, but that was a huge accomplishment for us and a long time coming in terms of the beginning of the year. So again, wanted to briefly highlight the multis win for us. We're now working on a bill that in Washington is commonly referred to as the Secure Act 2.0. A couple of years, 2019, we passed some legislation that had been out there for a number of years called the Secure Act. And these are these bills that include a lot of different kind of smaller retirement reforms that would really, especially put together, have a good impact in terms of helping strengthen our retirement system. So we passed the Secure Act a few years ago. The members really liked that bill. They liked actually being able to work on a bipartisan basis and work together to get some good policy done. And so, in fact, when we marked up the Secure Act, Chairman Neal and Ranking Brady directed the staff to put another bill together. So that's what we did. In October, we introduced legislation, Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady, that included, I believe, about 39, 40 provisions. These were provisions, things like requiring automatic enrollment for 401k plans going forward, so not for existing plans, but for new plans going forward. Something that happens occasionally with DB plans is that you may be a beneficiary and you've received an overpayment and in terms of your pension, and sometimes that always doesn't work so great when the employer comes in and tries to take the money back out of your account immediately, and you might not be prepared for that. So this provides some common sense rules. For example, it allows the employer, if they don't want to take the overpayment, that they don't have to do that. They don't have a fiduciary obligation to do that. But then there's some kind of participant protections in there if they do. Lost and found. We find that some folks, you have long careers and you may have worked for someone early on. There may have been a merger or acquisition and you can't find that employer anymore, and you're lost your pension account. So looking to provide some information to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to put together kind of a lost and found directory. So those are the types of provisions. These aren't, huge save the world type provisions, but, again, as a group of about 40 provisions, these are good common sense provisions that we were able to come together on a bipartisan basis and and hopefully move forward. We hope over the next few weeks that we'll be able to mark up this legislation in the committee, and then we'll just have to see where we go from there. So that is what I am working on right now in the short term. A couple of long-term projects that I have been also working on, and we'll have to see whether there's an opportunity to move these things this year, are the auto IRA legislation is one. Chairman Neal introduced the federal auto IRA legislation over 15 years ago now. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the states, understandably have just said, okay, we need the solution today. And, we've been a little slow, federal government. It's been 15 years. We're just going to do it on our own. And so a number of states, whether it's Oregon, California, Illinois, and others, have gone ahead and very much based on that original Mr. Neal legislation, which was back in the day bipartisan. Now many of these members have retired and left Congress, but Neal is last man standing, and Senator Whitehouse is the sponsor over in the Senate. But at its core, it's simply requiring an employer who does not offer a qualified plan to its employees that's of a size over 10 employees. It's been in business for over 3 years. For those types of employers, they would be required at a minimum to provide a payroll deduction, automatic enrollment, payroll deduction IRA to their employees. So provide that option that at least they have that kind of savings at work. And about 50% of American workers today aren't offered a retirement plan at work, and so we're trying to address this issue and really make a big dent. We have, I forgot to print it, but recently a trade association provided us with some data, and you combine the auto IRA with some reforms that I'll talk about in a second to the refundable savers credit, and you could see $6 trillion in new savings. And I want to say, I think it was over 50 million new participants. So you add these two reforms together, and this is where you're talking big time, where we could really be making a significant dent in terms of our savings crisis. Unfortunately, for many of us, we just haven't been able to save enough. I mean, life happens, pandemics happen, and we're all struggling, to get our kids. I have a 5-year-old, and she's only going back to school for the first time in person next week. So we've been over a year of having to figure this all out. And understandably, these expenses add up and you're not able to save for retirement. And so we do want to be, we have a significant retirement savings crisis in this country. And so we're trying to be helpful to that. So to that point, which I just alluded to it a minute ago, but a key kind of component to the auto IRA is the refundable savers credit. As you all know, there is a savers credit in existing law. Unfortunately, the savers credit is not refundable. So that means if you don't have any tax liability, if you don't pay taxes, which is a significant percentage of our population falls into that category between all the credits and deductions and things along those lines, this doesn't provide any benefit to you. And so one of the changes that we're looking at, and Neal has been a longtime supporter of it. Representative Chu has introduced the bill over here, Senator Wyden in the Senate, but it's making the bill refundable and collapsing the credit, making it a little simpler, and also requiring those amounts that you get from the refundable savers credit to be put into a retirement account as well. So it goes, the government really making it into a true match, a government match essentially. So those are the types of reforms that we're talking about. And auto IRA, when we've introduced it, always has been coupled with this kind of refundable savers credit and putting it into the accounts. And that's where the combination of those two, having this kind of quote unquote government match and then this mechanism to save is just really a powerful tool. So we'll be exploring opportunities this year, hoping that there might be an opportunity to move things along those lines. Again, they've been longtime priorities of the chairman. And one last thing that I'll highlight in terms of our agenda in the private retirement area are child savings accounts. We've been talking about that for the last few months. There have been child savings accounts proposals out there for years on a bipartisan basis. More recently, you've heard Senator Booker, Representative Presley, Senator Wyden and Casey have legislation. Basically, it's putting a sum of money, whatever that might be, in a child's account, upon birth, and the whole power of compounded interest. And then there are obviously and we're still kind of finalizing where we'll go on this, but there are different variations of this. But you could have the money there, and it's required to stay there until retirement, or you could more commonly they allow the child to use it for education when they reach college age, or to start a new business, or things along those lines. Our committee has been particularly interested in the issue of racial inequities, and we had a hearing on this in the healthcare space, looking at kind of the COVID crisis, and unfortunately that kind of brought that out. But it's not just a healthcare issue; it's obviously an economic issue as well, and it's a retirement pension issue. And so some academics have been writing about how child savings accounts can help with that issue. So that is one of the policy justifications for us really taking a closer look at child savings accounts, or commonly referred to as baby bonds, because the money goes into a bond, essentially a government bond. And so it's invested conservatively so that that money is there when you reach college age or retirement. So that is my little 15-minute blurb of what we are up to in the retirement space. I don't know, Hank, happy to take any questions that you might have, or not. But that's the update.
Kara, thank you so much for that great update. It's very enlightening and informative. I think Tony's going to be joining us as well, but we do have some questions for you. And let me begin with the way you started, which is talking about the relief package for the multi-employer plans. And I wanted to ask you to help me clear some myths that are out there. As you may or may not know, there are some critics and commentators who've criticized the relief package and essentially have said, those few but highly underfunded plans, that was the fault of the plan managers, of the joint trusteeship, blah blah blah. Essentially laying the blame at the feet of the plans. You started off by saying that it was really not the fault of the plans that they were severely underfunded. What is your understanding of why some of these plans became underfunded? And real briefly, or the bottom line is, are these commentators right? Is it the fault of the plans that they became underfunded?
No, I think they're absolutely wrong. It was things like industry deregulation. It's the trucking industry. You had these employers go out of business, and because of trucking deregulation, you had these big trucking companies that went out of business. And a big issue in the multi-space is this kind of last man standing issue. So basically what was happening to these plans is more and more employers were going bankrupt, but their participants, these people that worked for these employers, were still in the plan. So probably the best example of this is the UMWA plan, the mine workers plan. So as we all know, with what's happened with coal over the years, and we've moved towards other energy products and whatnot, more and more coal companies were going out of business, to the point where, with respect to the UMWA plan, there was literally only one employer left, and that employer was very close to going into bankruptcy. So that employer had the obligations of, hundreds and hundreds of participants that never had any interaction with that company. So it just was one of those things where the multi-employer pension idea and concept, back in the day, was a good idea. And frankly, again, it is still a smaller percentage of plans that had this problem. But unfortunately, these plans were huge plans. And so it is still working. There are a number of Western Conference Pension Plan is a very green level, good plan, really good shape. So you do have those plans that are in good shape. But unfortunately, because of these changes within industries, primarily, you had these situations where there just weren't any employers left. And so because of that, I think, because these participants were out there in some ways on their own, I think that's the best case of the government coming in and saying, okay, we need to, help out here, and that's what we did. But no, I do think that's very unfair criticism and not understanding what really happened, which was much more complicated.
Kara, thank you so much for clarifying that for us and dispelling that myth. And then some of these same critics and commentators then say, well, if you bail out or provide relief to multi-employer plans, aren't public pension plans next? Now, before you answer that, just as a reminder, as I'm sure all the people who are tuning into this webcast know, public pension plans have never asked for relief from the federal government, and nor do we plan to. But Kara, can you just state from your personal position, does providing relief to multi-employer plans in any way lead to public plans getting relief?
No, I mean, that was a common criticism we've heard as well, and it couldn't be further from the truth. As Hank just noted, no one is coming to us to ask for this relief, and from the public plan's perspective, and plus we have some jurisdiction, but really this is a state's issue, so we never really looked at it that way. These federal plan, the private sector plans, were subject to ERISA and the code and whatnot, and there is a smaller hook with respect to these state plans, but in general, these are state public plans that really are not within the jurisdiction of the federal government. So no, we were not thinking that this was a slippery slope, and again, the plans that you're talking about weren't even coming to us looking for this relief.
Great, thank you, Kara. Tony, do you have any questions for Kara?
Just one, Kara, that was a great presentation. We really appreciate your insights and your time. So thanks so much for doing that.
Sure.
Secure Act 2.0, there's a provision, and it doesn't trigger for DB plans often, but the required minimum distribution age is important because a lot of public employees certainly have 457Bs and 403Bs, even some grandfathered 401Ks. So the provision in Secure Act, the original, moved it to age 72. And there are provisions in, I think, both your bill in the House and in the Portman-Cardin bill to increase that age to 75. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, whether if legislation does move and go the distance, if that is a likely occurrence, because I think a lot of folks care about that.
Sure, no, that's a great question. And I would say in the Secure Act 2.0 and the Secure Act, that when we increased it to 72, that was one of our more popular provisions in that bill. And then because of that, we decided to go further. Now, the October bill there probably was, can't remember off the top of my head, but we jumped from 72 to 75, and I'm sure there was like a period of transition in there. We did find, and we were expecting this, that the score was going to be very, very expensive to make that huge jump. And so what we're looking at, although it's not final, is having it be scaled a little bit so that we go from 72 to 73 within 5 years, for example, within our 10-year window, budget window. But then outside of the window, we'd go from 74 to 75, like maybe an additional 6 or 7 years in the future. But in general, that is a very, very popular provision. And it just makes sense. I mean, number one, to have the 70 and a half made no sense with like in the middle of the year. So that was just complicated. And then I remember when I was first looking at these provisions, I mean, the 70 and a half came about in the 1960s. People are living longer. And so it just made sense to bring that age up into this modern world. And the reality is, for most of us, we're going to be, this isn't really an issue. Like I understand, I think it's important from a policy perspective. Federal government is giving these significant tax breaks and it's for retirement. This isn't for estate planning. We want you to use, as a federal government, the money in retirement. That being said, if you're going into retirement with $100,000 in savings, which is a very typical level, if not less, then you're really not having to worry about, you'll be lucky if you make it to your death with having any money left. With $100,000, if you retire at age, let's say 65 or 70, that's really not a tremendous amount of money for potentially living for another 20 years. So it's an important provision, and yes, a version of that, although we're still kind of playing with it, will be in the marked up bill.
That's very good to know. And then on infrastructure, over the years, there have been lots of different proposals. I'm sure you've seen them and you've been in the discussions to try to incentivize public pensions to do more in the way of investing in infrastructure. In recent times, it's kind of taken the form of public plans should actually own the asset and then the revenue stream that comes with that asset. And again, there are various flavors of that proposal that are out there. As you develop infrastructure, and the committee's going to play a huge role in that. Have you heard much about it? Are you in the development of such an incentive?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tony. In previous lives and previous jobs, I've worked on that issue. In particular, when I worked for Senator Wyden, he had some interest in terms of this. And it always seemed like it was like, yeah, there's all this money and we have this infrastructure need. It seemed like a logical thing. But the more that, at least I'm just speaking for myself, the more I looked into it, a lot of public plans today are already investing in infrastructure. And in some ways, if they wanted to invest more, they could. There weren't really these barriers in current law to be investing in infrastructure. If anything, what I found is it was more political barriers, because let's say you're a plan and you're investing in a toll road, but you may have some political pressure not to increase the tolls, even though really you should be for your participants' perspective, and maybe there's a reason it's costing you more to maintain that road, but there may be some political pressure not to do that. So there was always, when you talk to some of the plans, they would raise that, and I thought that was a really fair issue. So it is one of those issues that always seems to come back up again. Ironically, I have not heard of it recently. Let me take that back. Someone actually did reach out to me, just one person a few months ago, but it hasn't been the drumbeat that I have heard in the past, especially considering that now is the time that we might be working on infrastructure. So I do think that it probably will, resurface, and that people will be talking about it, because it is something that does seem to keep coming up. And I do again think that there seems to be this kind of general interest of there's this huge pot of money, and folks point to Canada and doing work in here. But I guess two things. Number one, I always noted that folks, like the plans themselves, were always a little nervous as to what we were doing here. So that's a fair point. And then again, to my earlier point, if the plans today want to invest in infrastructure, the U.S. Chamber did a whole panel on this, and we did a deep dive with JCT and others, and it seems like that there really weren't any legal barriers to doing this, but there were other factors that they have to in terms of any investment that they were considering, which seemed fair.
Thank you, Karen. No, that's very helpful. And, NCPERS, Hank can speak for NCPERS, of course, not on the advocacy side of such an idea, but it's such an important proposal that we want to keep, very close tabs on what's being discussed.
Yeah, sure. At least from a Ways and Means perspective, I'm not aware of that being discussed right now in terms of development, at least.
Great. And Kara, we have about 5 more minutes, and just to touch on an area that you said was a little bit of a longer term issue, the federal auto IRA. Obviously, you know that NCPERS is a strong proponent of the auto IRA proposals for those who are employed by businesses who do not have a retirement plan of their own. So we think conceptually, I think that's a great idea. Do you have any details about the federal auto IRA, and specifically, as you envision this, do you envision having sort of exemptions or carve-outs for those states that have already embarked on this road?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think it will. There have been, Chairman Neal has had a few iterations of it. We've had kind of the auto IRA that's been out there for a while. Then we were kind of, that had been out there for a while, so trying to do something new. And we kind of put together more of an auto 401k. So instead of putting you into an IRA, you went into an actual ERISA plan. The more recent iterations is kind of a combination of the two, that the kind of floor would be the auto IRA. So like at the minimum, you have to do that, but then you could do these other more favorable plans for employees if you wanted to. I would say, unfortunately, with respect to the federal auto IRA, even though it started really as a bipartisan issue, it's become less so. And so it would be the type of thing that if we were to do, it would probably be in reconciliation. So reconciliation is this budget process that we have to go through that is very complicated. And we may have to make some modifications to actually fit within it. So that's one thing that we're looking at. In terms of your second question, yes. I mean, of course, for the plans, we really praise, and it's really been amazing. And these states have been on the cutting edge in terms of getting these auto IRA arrangements out there. So we certainly don't want to undercut any of that work. And so we certainly, there's language in the bill that would say that if you're a state that has an existing state auto IRA, you're good. You don't have to do the federal auto IRA. That being said, we do think from a policy perspective, having this kind of patchwork of different auto IRAs around the country probably isn't the best from a policy perspective. So if you're a state that does not have an enacted auto IRA, you would just do the federal. And so that's generally how it works. But yes, we want to be sensitive to these states really have done amazing work. And we're really looking at, the best practices of what's worked in some of these states, especially Oregon in particular, just because I happen to work for members from Oregon for quite some time. So I've always had a special place in my heart for the folks of Oregon. And watching that state and others has really been pretty remarkable. And they've had some really great success. So it just sounds like maybe we'll be hearing a little bit about later today. But yes, that we would have a carve out for those folks.
Kara, I can only speak for myself, but I'm very excited to hear that this is something that you and your boss are looking at. I mean, to your point, I think this would be a fabulous sort of hand in glove, so a federal approach of comedy, where states do their part and the federal government does its part as well. And as the concept moves along and the proposal moves along, please keep us in mind. We'd be delighted to have conversations with you and your boss and your colleagues as this thing moves forward. And again, just to underscore what you were saying in your formal remarks about saving, it's also a matter of not only finding the time, but finding the easy path. And one of the data points that it's coming out is that people who have participated in the 3 state programs have continued to contribute into their retirement programs in California, Oregon, and Illinois, even through this COVID crisis, even through this K-curve recovery, where folks on the lower end of the economics scale aren't doing as well as those who are on the upper half. And even through these harsh times, there's still savings. And so as long as people are given an opportunity to save, they will.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. It really has been powerful. So. And you're right, especially during a pandemic, it was pretty amazing results that folks have had.
Kara, you've been so generous with your time and with your knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us this year by remote. Hopefully next year in 2022, we can do a more traditional program in person where we can sit next to each other. Thank you again for being here.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Kara. All right, moving on to our agenda. Next, we'll hear from Tony Rhoda. Tony is the principal at Williams & Jensen in Washington, D.C. He began his professional career as a research assistant in the British House of Commons and then worked on the legislative staff of the U.S. Congress. Since joining Williams & Jensen, Tony has managed projects that have resulted in specific regulatory relief and changes to statutory law, including the Internal Revenue Code. He has helped many clients in the retirement area, including statewide, county, and municipal pension plans throughout the country. Tony has also provided fiduciary training and drafted ethics policies for pension boards. He is a member of NAPA's executive board, frequent presenter at national conferences and webinars, and author of numerous articles on matters affecting public pension plans. Also, he is our lobbyist at NCPERS. Tony, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hank. It's great to be here. As you just said to Kara, it'll be nice when we all get together in person again. And I am looking forward to that very much. It's nice to also have heard from Kara up front and her insights, and that'll kind of guide me as I get into some of those areas. But I'm going to work off of this PowerPoint, which I think is visible to everyone. And we can start with the first slide. You can skip on. And these issue areas are going to click in. So you could click on the first. I'm going to talk about the recent spate of federal assistance to states and localities and the interplay with that and public pension plans. You can click again. We're going to talk about investments, particularly infrastructure, which we just talked about a little bit with Kara, and ESG type issues, and then go ahead and click. And of course, as all the public pension plans are tax qualified under the Internal Revenue Code, we have to pay very close attention to the tax agenda. And I will spend a good deal of time on that. So yeah, so this first slide really just kind of encapsulates what happened. The federal government provided extensive COVID relief. They did put a restriction on using that relief for pensions. It's not the first time. We've seen previous attempts, and we may see future attempts. So let's slip on to the next slide. So the extensive legislation that was passed, $350 billion in new federal aid to states and localities. And, you know, it had been fairly, this was the Biden initiative, of course. It had been fairly quiet on the front of putting restrictions on that funding. The states and the localities and their advocates in Washington were doing their best to keep it clean of any restrictions and have the maximum flexibility possible. Two things happened late in the process, however, late being sometime in February. First, the state of North Dakota, the leaders in the Senate, announced that they were going to use up to $1 billion in the federal aid they received to make a deposit into the North Dakota pension fund. Then we heard from a number of states who said, well, we don't really need the federal aid, so we're going to use it to lower taxes. Neither of these pronouncements, sat very well with Congress and members of either party. So what we found was that third bullet came into being, which said that no state or territory can deposit any of this federal aid into a pension fund. That is, of course, identical to the language on localities. There was also a provision, the language of which is a little hard to follow, and I think we're going to get guidance from the Treasury Department, but essentially addressing the second point I raised, which was no state can use the federal aid for a revenue cut in their own state or locality. So those two issues were raised late, and they actually did create an environment where Congress felt they had to do something to put restrictions on it. You can go to the next slide. Now, what we had enacted, of course, was that language that said no deposit into a pension fund, very specific language. At the end of 2020, however, there was a bipartisan proposal on the table, which was much more far-reaching and potentially dangerous, at least in concept. And that was saying that no state or locality can take funds from the federal government under this act if they make any pension enhancements. The language here on your screen talks about changing total pension obligation, a term that was not really defined in the proposal. But using 2019 as a benchmark and saying you can't do anything to increase your total pension obligations in 21, 22. So if you take this money, your hands are tied. Go to the next slide, please. And that wasn't the first time we had seen something like that. In 2015, in the Elementary Secondary Education Act, there was an attempt to pass the House, in fact, to say that you can't use any funds in this federal act if those funds are used for more than your, the term of art used was your pension normal cost. And then they went on to define normal costs to not include any accrued unfunded liabilities, which is normally part of your employer contribution that is actuarially determined. So we found that to be very concerning as a precedent back in 2015. We were able, through the Senate, to ensure that that language was not included in the final ESEA legislation. But again, you see this kind of concept running back to us in 2019. And please go to the next slide. So in the future, I think we have to be very careful. I'd like to say what happened in 2019 was just pandemic related, but when you have that 2015 example, I can't make that case. You know, this has been on Congress's mind now for 6 years, try to find some way of hamstringing public pensions. And it's not all members of Congress, certainly, but the notion is out there, and it is concerning and warrants our certain attention to it. So let's go to the next slide. So investments, we're going to talk infrastructure and we're going to talk ESG, both of which have been in the news a great deal. You could please skip to the next slide, please. Yeah. So there have been 3 proposals out there on infrastructure. I didn't get into the details with Kara. We certainly didn't have the time, but I know she's well aware of these different proposals that have been out there. The first is something that the House Budget Chairman has put forward in proposal form. Then there's a loan proposal, PIFIA for short, and then a clarification of tax treatment. So we'll go through each one. If you could go to the next slide. So House Budget Chairman Yarmouth's bill, his kind of model would be to have the U.S. Treasury Department issue bonds, $75 billion worth initially, but his draft proposal had another $300 billion that could be possible. And the bonds would mature, not for 40 years, could not be resold. You see the restrictions there. But the item of great interest, of course, to investors would be that these bonds would have an interest rate 200 basis points above the 30-year Treasury. So for a safe investment, 200 basis points above what you could get through Treasury is very appealing. The other interesting facet here of the chairman's proposal is that the only purchasers, eligible purchasers of these bonds would be pension plans, ERISA plans, and state and local plans. So clearly designed to bring folks, our community into these bond purchases and then use the proceeds for infrastructure projects. Now, Hank knows well, we spent a good bit of time with Chairman Yarmouth. In fact, he appeared at an NCPERS conference, spent a lot of time with his staff as well. I'm not sure the proposal is going to be put forward, though. It's interesting. It's certainly something we would want to pay very close attention to. But now's the time, if it's going to happen ever, because of the push on infrastructure. We could go on to the next slide. For shorthand, PIFIA. It's a complicated loan program, quite frankly, that states and localities could take advantage of. It's being put forward by state officials and a number of other stakeholders, but essentially it would allow for a state or locality to take this 30-year loan, and then the borrower would transfer the monies to the pension plan. And a portion of these funds, of course, would have to be used for infrastructure. And then there would be savings to the fund, the plan, because of this infusion of revenue, essentially. And then they would use this, they would be required to use these savings in year 4 for infrastructure projects as well. The first 3 years would have to be used for COVID. We've had a lot of discussions in the public pension community on this here in Washington. It is a complicated proposal. I don't see that this is going to get traction. Interestingly, I just read this morning in the NCPERS clips, which I recommend to you, that the New Jersey State Senate President Steve Sweeney has introduced legislation at the state level to create a separate trust fund, which would essentially be able to hold assets, the toll road, the reservoir, the water treatment center, and have that revenue stream coming into that trust fund that would be used to kind of buy down the pension unfunded liability for New Jersey. So it's these types of things are out there, and I would say we have to keep our eyes very closely on this in the next few months, because this is when Congress is going to deal with it. And then finally, the next slide on tax treatment. So there was this notion, and Kara dispelled it to a large degree, saying that she does not see any barriers in the tax code for these types of investments. And we have seen throughout the country a number of plans and in well-publicized fashion become aggressive investors in infrastructure and assets, and hold assets as well, and reap the stream of income from those assets. There was legislation, and this is also part of the PIFIA proposal, to try to clarify the tax treatment of when or if an asset, public infrastructure asset, is transferred to a public pension fund so that it does not lose its tax preferred status, and the bonds do not lose their tax exempt status. If anyone was going to hear about this, it would be Kara. But again, we are somewhat early in the infrastructure legislative process. So I wanted to put this on your radar as something that we could see. And certainly, the goal here on infrastructure is to try to get a bill to the president by July 4th. I don't think that's possible, but it may be possible by August the 1st. So we're going to look very closely at what's happening in the next few months. And now let's go to the next general. No, I'm sorry. We're still on the investment track. And, ESG investing, you can't pick up the Wall Street Journal or any major media right now or online and not see a great deal about climate change and investments. So at the end of the Trump administration, a rule was finalized by the Department of Labor, which would have dampened enthusiasm. This was related only to ERISA plans. However, a lot of state and local plans, do look at the ERISA guidelines when they're formulating their own guidance, particularly on fiduciary responsibilities. So this final rule would certainly have dampened enthusiasm, I think, for ESG type investments. The Biden administration has come in and said, first, we're going to review this. And then within the last couple of weeks, they said, well, we're really not going to enforce this rule. And we're likely going to do our own guidance later this year. And this is it doesn't go by the heading ESG, but if you wanted to look at it, it's a pecuniary factors rulemaking, and I'd be happy to provide that information to you. And then the next slide, Senator Feinstein of California has introduced an interesting proposal, and NCPERS has endorsed it. So FSOC is an entity, a regulatory entity created out of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is charged with looking at systemic risk. And, prior to Dodd-Frank, the argument was, well, we're too focused on each individual company and we're not really looking sector-wise and systemically. So the Feinstein bill would essentially require FSOC to specify whether there is any type of systemic risk and what should be looked at in the way of consolidating, because that's what they're all about, kind of consolidating the regulatory review in this area. I think that's an important measure, and NCPERS was one of the original endorsees of that proposal. So I'm looking at the time. I've got time to go to the tax agenda, so we can flip to the next slide. Kara talked and saved me a number of words on RMDs. So let's skip off the first page and we can skip to the HR 8696 slide. Yeah, so that's the House proposal, and she's of course right. It would have gone to 75 and it would have done so very abruptly by 2021. And there was also a provision which we didn't get into, which would exempt completely from an RMD trigger holders of small accounts. And you see the test there. So all your DC plans aggregated to 100,000 or less. So that would be viewed as an individual who would not have to worry at all about required minimum distributions. Go to the next slide. And the Senate was also on board with moving it to 75. This was at the end of last year. They had a much longer timeline to get there. And from what Kara described, I think we're going to see an even more stretched out timeline to get to 75, which I think makes sense. It is fairly an abrupt change, and take the first few years early. I think she said, moved to 73, and then within 3 years, and then move beyond that, outside of the budget window, all the way to age 75. So look for those provisions in what's coming. You could skip to the next slide. This is a provision that we've worked on, and NCPERS was one of the original supporters of getting HELPs into the law. And the HELPs provision is found in that section of the code, 402L, and it allows for the $3,000, up to $3,000 exclusion from income for retired first responders if the funds are paid directly from the retirement system to the provider of the insurance. And that element of direct payment is a administrative problem for a number of plans. We're hoping to, we're really pushing to repeal that provision and then double the $3,000 annual exclusion. That number hasn't been changed since it was enacted in 2006. And then also index that number going forward so we don't have to keep coming back to Congress. So many provisions in the tax code are indexed now, and it only makes sense to do it here. I will ask you to go to the next slide. So President Biden, unclear, if he will push this, but he had talked about in his campaign literature of replacing the current deferral system with a refundable 26% tax credit. Of course, this would be a sea change in how we save for retirement. The way it was drafted, it wasn't clear if it would hit those plans that public workers are generally saving in addition to their defined benefit plans, but 457B, 403B immediately jumped to mind. So there were a lot of questions with this proposal. I wanted to make sure you were aware that President Biden had this on his agenda, as it were. If this does not manifest itself in the consideration of the Secure Act 2.0, I don't think it's going to come back later. I think what's going to happen is that the administration is going to see, for instance, Chairman Neal's push on some of the items that Kara talked about, the auto IRA, the refundable savings credit, the child savings accounts, and probably put their energy behind that. But I thought certainly you need to be aware this was in the president's materials. We can go to the next slide. Pepta. You've all heard me talk about Pepta for years. This has been introduced since 2010, always by the same author in the House, Congressman Devin Nunes. Pepta would be a reporting requirement on plan sponsors, and it would require, you can go to the next slide because that has the basic breakdown. 2 sets of reports, one using your assumed rate of return, and then the next using the Treasury bond yield curve. Of course, your numbers using the Treasury bond yield curve are going to show a dramatically lower funded status. All of these reports and funded status outcomes would be posted on Treasury Department website. We believe this is unfortunately designed to make state and local governmental plans look poorly funded and call into question what they're doing and the benefits that they've promised. And it will certainly cause tremendous turmoil in the state capitals. NCPERS has been an adamant opponent of Pepta. I did want to mention, though, that the author of the legislation, historical author, he did not introduce the bill in the most previous Congress. Congressman Devin Nunes of California is the second most ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee. And with the announcement last week of the first most senior Republican on the committee of his retirement, Kevin Brady of Texas, Devin Nunes will certainly be in the mix. It's not automatically his. The Republicans will have what they always do, some type of, presentations are made, quite frankly, by those who are seeking that position. And there may be more than Congressman Nunes. But, you have to take it seriously if you have someone of that level of seniority interested in a proposal like that. So let's move to revenue raisers. I think we've got about 5 minutes. I'll run through these fairly quickly. You've seen, I have 4 slides on the unrelated business income tax, and they really, you can go to the next one. They really kind of walk you through what has happened with it in the past. Most recent attempts, the House had passed the UBIT application to state and local plans in the 2017 tax bill. It was dropped in conference. You can go to the next slide. And this one provides more of a historical, this was actually the arguments that were made at that time as to why the House Republicans believed it was simply a clarification of current law, and while we said, in fact, there's another provision of the code that provides us protection from any such tax. You can go to the next slide. And then historically, what the underpinnings are of where the IRS has been on it and Treasury. That could be very useful to you. And then the final slide just talks about, the revenue impact of it, which was over $1 billion in its most recent score. And then we'll go on to Rothification. The Roth method is funding your accounts post-tax. The Treasury Department usually likes that because they get the tax up front. Congress usually likes that because they get to use any change to stimulate more Roth activity as a revenue increase. So, as they're paying for various proposals going forward, keep in mind that that has been out there in the past. And you could skip to the financial transactions tax slide. And the third revenue raiser that we have to keep our eyes on, this would not be a direct tax on public pension plans. And it's something that I know Hank has studied and talked with a lot of experts on. But this notion of a financial transactions tax that Senator Sanders and Senator Schatz have at varying basis points is something that will raise a tremendous amount of money, and because of that, and because of the ability to start this tax at such a low level, even lower than what Senator Schatz has at 10 basis points, would still bring in a tremendous amount of money. So when you're thinking about big things being done in Washington, these things have to be paid for. And the financial transactions tax is something that's already drafted in legislative form, has some following in Congress. So be aware that that's out there. And finally, there are two non-tax issues. And I don't have to talk about the windfall elimination provision because that is something that Kara talked about and Congressman Davis. I will just mention for this next slide then, that there has been a proposal in the previous Congress to lower the Medicare eligibility age for retired first responders to age 50. Legislation was introduced by Sherrod Brown, Senator Brown of Ohio, who you're going to hear from later. And then in the House by Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, who spoke to your conference. I believe he was your policymaker of the year last year. Both very serious legislators. I don't know how this goes. There's a lot of discussion about lowering the overall Medicare eligibility rate to 60. So this is going to be discussed, I'm sure, as part of the mix, but unclear at this point if, in fact, it will get the kind of traction it needs in this climate. So I haven't left much time, Hank, for questions. If you or the audience have any, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Tony, for that great presentation. To our audience members, obviously, Tony covered a lot in the 30 minutes he was allotted. To help supplement your understanding of the issues that Tony covered and other issues in more granular detail, we do have the 2021 Legislative Issues book. It is available on our website. As I mentioned, it covers a lot of issues, many of which Tony covered and some that he didn't have time to cover, and it's in much more detail. And so hopefully you'll have a chance to look on our website. I believe we also emailed it to folks who have RSVP to this telecast. Tony, Kara alluded to it, but I'd love to get your take as well, which is, again, a lot of different proposals out there. What are the likelihood of any of them passing? And if they do pass, what is the likelihood that they will pass in a bipartisan fashion?
I think I'll take two that are likely, are more likely than the others to go the distance. The first is what, we're all calling the Secure Act 2.0. And as Kara described, it has a lot of, separate provisions that are important to a group. Nothing that's going to be a tremendous, sea change. But I think the Secure Act 2.0 has bipartisan support. I think both Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady want to keep it that way. And then it does have bipartisan support in the Senate with Senator Cardin of Maryland, a Democrat, and Senator Portman of Ohio, a Republican. So I do think that is something that could go to the distance, and have bipartisan support. I think infrastructure is the next one that can go the distance. And unfortunately, as I see infrastructure, I am not at all confident that that's going to get bipartisan support, because it falls into the same problem infrastructure legislation's fallen into for decades now, which is how do you pay for it? And will any Republicans come along to raise taxes to pay for it? And thus far, I'm not really seeing that is where the Republicans are going to end up. It could be on the Republican side, it could end up being a mixed bag. But they held together completely against the Biden COVID-19 package. So sometimes when you're in the minority, it's always easier to stay together in the minority, because you feel, of course, you make the argument that you've been put upon, and you don't have a voice. So I'm not confident that infrastructure can get bipartisan support.
Thank you, Tony. And again, thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned with Kara, hopefully next year in 2022, when we do have our legislative conference in person in our normal time slot of late January, we look forward to having you join us once again and giving us an update on where we are and where we hope to be at the end of 2022. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Hank.
And now we're going to shift gears. We're going to shift from the federal government to states, and from public sector pensions to private sector retirement programs. And to lead us in this discussion, we have with us Angela Antonelli, who is the research professor and executive director of the Center for Retirement Initiatives, CRI, at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. She is also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. As the executive director of CRI, Angela works closely with policymakers, states, and stakeholders to strengthen retirement security by expanding the availability and improving the effectiveness of retirement savings, investments, and income solutions for private sector workers. Prior to assuming her position at Georgetown, Angela served in senior positions in the government, consulting, and nonprofit sectors, including as Assistant Secretary and CFO of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, with responsibilities for $30 billion budget and implementing a range of economic policies and programs. We're delighted that you're able to join us today, Angela. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Hank, for having me. It's my pleasure. And thank you to NCPERS. NCPERS and you, Hank, have been a terrific partner with the Georgetown Center for Retirement Initiatives in effort to make sure that all workers have access to robust retirement benefits and understanding the value of that lifetime income plays in building retirement security. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about what's going on in the states. And in order to build that retirement security and build that income, it's really important, sort of as a first step, that when we're talking about private sector workers, that they need to have access to a way to save for retirement. And as Kara touched on, and you've touched on, and Tony's touched on, state efforts have become a major part of the progress that's being made within the private sector workforce to effectively achieve that expanded access to ways to save for retirement. And you need to be able to do that in order to get to retirement income and build that retirement security. So what are some of the challenges that we face? Next slide. There's a significant gap in access to retirement savings among private sector workers today. The reality is, in the United States, employers are not required to offer workers a retirement savings plan. And so if you look to the right on the slide, there's 124.6 million private sector workers in the United States. And analysis done recently, released by Georgetown's Center for Retirement Initiatives, confirms that the estimate is about 46%, almost half of today's private sector workforce does not have access to a workplace retirement savings program. They go to work every day and they don't have their employers offering them a way to save for retirement. So that's about 57.3 million workers as of 2020. So why should we be concerned about this huge gap among private sector workers and that lack of access to a way to save for retirement? Next slide. The reality is we have an aging population that's living longer, and this significantly increases the urgency and the importance of this issue. Senior households are growing in number as a share of the population. On the right, you see the rapid decline in our dependency ratio. That is the number of working age households who are the number that can support the increase in elderly households. And what does that mean? From a math perspective, you have fewer workers able to support an increasingly aging population that unfortunately is not prepared for retirement and have insufficient retirement income. They're not retirement ready. And what does that mean? That puts a tremendous amount of pressure on federal, state, and local governments to provide the necessary programs to support an aging population with insufficient retirement income. And that pressure is enormous, and I'll get to that in a minute. But also, as we look to the future, our younger generations, we have the baby boomers that have been retiring, 10,000 Americans every day. And over the next 20 years, though, we'll start to see millennials, and the younger generations are going to be in their prime working years. And as we'll see, they really are not, they don't have that access that they need to save for retirement. So they're not saving at the levels that we would like to see. And they really do need to be saving to prepare for that. So we're looking at, over the next couple of decades, if we don't do anything, we're just going to have this problem become worse and worse with our generations of workers who, when they need to stop working, really are not sufficiently prepared. And again, there's a tremendous pressure on government to address that issue as we look to the future. So as we think about the future generations that are completely unprepared for retirement, again, we've seen over time the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution form of savings in our retirement system, particularly among the private sector workers today in the United States. And retirement savings are often the only savings that people have. And as we've seen during COVID, when we have these kinds of economic challenges, government makes it easier for people to raid those retirement savings in order to get through those difficult times. And so that's another challenge. And the COVID-19 pandemic has just been another setback for retirement preparedness. Fortunately, it hasn't been as bad as we thought it might be. But at the same time, there have been tens of thousands of Americans who have had to raid their retirements in order to get through this very difficult historic period. The numbers are here. I don't want to go through them in a lot of detail, but if you're looking at those at or near retirement, almost a third, don't have a defined benefit pension or retirement savings that they're going to be relying on. The challenges for our older population, often underestimating the costs of healthcare in retirement, not prepared to address the needs with respect to the costs of long-term care. We have older workers and retirees who are carrying a tremendous amount of debt at historically high levels that we've not seen before either. So not only have they not been able to save for retirement, but they're also entering that period of retirement carrying a lot of other debt and expenses that they are wholly unprepared to address. With respect to the younger generations and millennials, as an example, too many of them, about 2/3 of millennial workers really have not been able to save for retirement. They were hit by the financial recession of 2008. They've now had to get through the COVID pandemic. They really have had a challenging time over the past decade as they've entered the workforce. And again, they'll be continue to reach those peak working years over the next decade or so. And again, they're entering with a lot of student loan debt that also makes it more difficult for them to save for retirement. And when we have gone through the COVID pandemic, fortunately, again, we've not seen the levels of withdrawals that we would have feared, but there's an educational process, and really having workers, individuals understand that, okay, you have to get through a difficult period, but understand that if you're going to take money out of your retirement, what does that really mean over time? And that if you take out $3,000 today, that might just seem like, okay, it's $3,000 to get you through the period, but that really ultimately over the longer term means you're taking $40,000 or more out of your retirement at the time of retirement. So it's a challenge in terms of really understanding and how we can help workers become more financially resilient, get through challenging times. The concept of building emergency savings is an important discussion, because ultimately we want to help workers not only save for retirement, but again, if savings has been the only savings, that gets raided during difficult times. So how do we protect retirement savings and look at the picture more holistically and help workers get through difficult, challenging times, emergency savings being a component of that, and by doing that, help to ultimately protect retirement savings in the long run. And then again, if you look by race and gender, women are almost half of the workforce today, but unfortunately, they often have part-time work that doesn't come with benefits. We've also seen in COVID pandemic, the data that has shown that hundreds of thousands of women have left the workforce. If they come back into the workforce, those years that they've lost will be a significant setback on their ability to be prepared for retirement. And what's stunning is when we look at Social Security today, already 1 in 5 Americans rely on Social Security for 90% of their income in retirement. 1 in 5 already today. And if we look at women, elderly unmarried women, nearly half of them already rely on Social Security for 90% of their income. So if you look at the numbers, I think it's easy to show that there are tremendous challenges that not only are those at or near retirement are already facing, but our younger generations, it's a tsunami coming down over the next decade or two if we do not get real about these issues and help them and give them the tools and the access and the mechanisms to be able to save for retirement. The costs to government are enormous. Studies in Pennsylvania and Colorado, in both Pennsylvania and Colorado, again, if nothing changes and we have the projected retirement over the next couple of decades, 10 to 15 years, and the population that's expected to retire with insufficient retirement income in both of these states, it's in excess of multi-billions of dollars. In Colorado, $9 billion, and in Pennsylvania, $14 billion. And the reality is these are workers who will be increasingly dependent on government. Instead of, if they're able to save for retirement, they build that retirement income. They're retirees who can put money into the economy and help the economy grow. And a modest level of savings can make an enormous difference. And I'll show that when I get into the specifics of the state programs. Just $1,200 a year, $100 a month over a person's working career can be life-changing. It can significantly improve one's retirement readiness and significantly reduce those pressures on government and the economy. So this is why states are acting. In the absence of federal action, understanding the significance of the access gap and how many private sector workers are really just not being given the tools to be able to prepare for retirement, states have stepped up. They understand the challenges that we face. And we now see 13 state programs and 1 city that have enacted these new programs. Many of these programs are the auto IRA's secure choice model. You might also hear it referred to as work and save. And the states that are green are states that are active. We have 3 that are currently active: California, Illinois, and Oregon. We expect Colorado, Connecticut, and Maryland to come on board in 2021 and launch their programs. Outside of the auto IRA secure choice program, those are states in which employers who do not offer their workers a way to save have to give their workers the opportunity to save through the state facilitated program. So employers are required to do something. They either have to have a plan on their own and establish that. If they don't do that, they have to give their workers the opportunity to save through the state program. There are other states that have voluntary models. It could be an IRA, it could be a marketplace, it could be a multiple employer plan arrangement. A MEP is a 401k ERISA regulated arrangement. Because it is an ERISA regulated arrangement, because 401ks are employee benefit plans, states cannot mandate that employers participate in a state facilitated MEP. And then New Mexico is a state that has a combination of an IRA and a marketplace. But this gives you the picture of the range of options, but most states, and increasingly so, are gravitating towards the auto IRA secure choice model. And also there's increasing standardization in the design of those programs across states. Next slide. The characteristics of these auto IRA programs are that they are automatic, again, taking advantage of auto enrollment, auto escalation. Workers are significantly more likely to save when they are auto enrolled in programs. We know this not only through the experience of the state programs, but also through private sector employer sponsored plans. Workers, for them, it's voluntary. They have full control over their participation in these programs, and they can choose to opt out of savings. These accounts can stay with the worker. There is an account, they can move from job to job in the states, and again, continue to save using that state facilitated IRA that they have. There's no cost. These programs are designed in a way that through fees on savers, which are very low, ultimately the costs will be covered for the program. So there are no costs to states, to taxpayers, or to employers. So they're meant to be by design self-sustaining. And they truly are public-private partnerships. States enter into long-term contracts with program administrators, investment managers, and others who work closely with them to stand up these programs. They assume a lot of risks and are true partners in setting up these programs to be successful and help workers save for retirement. This is something that I'm happy to show every day. This number gets larger and larger. And this is where we are with just 3 programs in terms of California, Illinois, and Oregon, those state facilitated auto IRA programs, as well as Mass and Washington, Massachusetts being a state facilitated MEP, and Washington Marketplace. But as you can see, the vast majority of the assets in the programs so far are in Oregon, Illinois, and California. In Oregon, they just crossed 100 million. 100 million of this 220 is in the Oregon Saves program, which has been the program that has been up and running for the longest period of time. But this is exciting. The number is increasing rapidly month over month. The California program, the state has more than 7 million eligible workers. They've just gone through the first phase. So there's a lot more implementation to happen in California. And again, as I mentioned, we have several other states, Connecticut, Maryland, Colorado, and others that will be coming online in the near future. So this number will continue to rapidly grow over time, and it's very exciting. The auto IRA programs, this is something you can refer to, but the thing that makes me feel great about all of the efforts by so many is really pointing to the success that we're seeing with these programs, where those who have questioned whether or not low and moderate income workers who are in so many small businesses that don't have access to a way to save, want to save for retirement. And the answer is absolutely yes. When they're given the opportunity to save, they are taking advantage of it by tens of thousands. And again, as I pointed out, if you look at the bottom left, the assets again in these these 3 states to date is just about is over $210 million now. And if you look at the bottom, we have almost 33,000 employers who've registered, who are now helping their workers save for retirement where that was not happening before. And the number of funded accounts with dollars in them exceeding over 300,000. So we think about just 2 or 3 years ago, all of these workers, all of these employers, they were not saving for retirement. So it's very exciting. And you can see with the average monthly contributions, they're putting in a little over $100 a month. Again, that's going to be somewhere around $1,200 a year, but that really adds up over time. And these programs have held up, as Hank noted, really well during COVID. We did not see them perform any worse with respect to, as I mentioned, the ability to withdraw funds. That was not happening. They performed as well or better than what we saw happen with trends with private sector employer-sponsored plans. So again, it's a very exciting development that we've been seeing in these states that have been adopting these programs, and it's really making a significant difference. There's tremendous employer and employee support for these programs. Pew has conducted surveys in Oregon of employers and about their experiences with these programs. Businesses are saying in large numbers that, again, as we have said and as we predicted, that they pay little or no costs in order to implement these programs with their workers. Their employers are not hearing anything from their workers of concern about these programs. Again, in fact, many of them are saving for these programs. And in a state where you see auto escalation like Oregon, we already have workers, they're saving at 5%. That's where they start. That's a higher level than people thought workers were going to want to be defaulted into savings. They're staying at that 5%. They're being auto escalated. So you have some people in Oregon who are saving 7% now because they've gone through 2 rounds of auto escalation. And again, employers, if anything, over time, have been growing more excited and more enthusiastic about these state programs and what it has done for their workers. It's a great benefit. It's a great way to help retain workers, help these small businesses be more competitive in the market. Georgetown, we did analysis looking at the benefits of universal access. As I mentioned at the top, where we have 57.3 million workers today who lack access to a way to save for retirement, we then looked at the benefits of what it means for them to have access. And if we had something national in scale, and Kara talked about this and Hank as well, and the importance of expanding that access. So again, the states have really been driving change and innovation and pushing this issue forward. The success that we've seen in the states, I think, is only contributing to folks understanding that we do need to offer all of our workers in the United States access to a way to save for retirement and the significant difference that it can make. We also then broke that down in terms of a state level analysis because the efforts are continuing in the states, and for state policymakers to understand if they're essentially setting up a universal access program in their state, what it means to their state in order to do that, the number of workers that can be covered, and again, the projections in terms of the amount that a worker can save in an auto IRA program. And again, the experience that we've seen in other countries and from the US has shown that you can expand access successfully in a simple, low cost effective way. And we can significantly, if we have that national program, again, understanding that there's, workers, some workers will make a decision that they can't save, but the vast majority of them will. And if we're able to do that over the next decade, we'll have as many as 40 million. A significant amount of that gap that I mentioned will be closed because these workers will now be saving for retirement. And one of the things to keep in mind in the design of a federal approach, we see this at the state level, is that we're going to be the most successful in closing that access gap if we cover as many workers as possible. So as part of our analysis, we show the impacts of where you draw that threshold in terms of employers that are covered. In Oregon, all employers are covered. Not surprisingly, if you're covering all employers, you're going to have the highest level of employees and workers who are saving for retirement. As you start to pull people, exempt employers out of that, you're not going to be as successful in closing that access gap. But again, at the end of the day, we'll see significant increases in savings and asset accumulations and tremendous boost to our economy by having national universal access. And I really wanted to show this because I think it's a powerful illustration of how a modest amount of savings can make an enormous difference and the impact that we can have in strengthening retirement readiness in the next couple of decades. If we have a young auto IRA saver who starts at age 25, and we do have a lot of young people in these programs, they're working in, cafes or salons or in the agricultural industry or the retail industry. they're putting away that $100 a month, that $1,200 a year. But if they're able to do that, and assuming that that's really what they do for a 40-year period, you see that it can add up in terms of contributions in to more than six figures, $110,000. But then keep in mind, having that money there and not touching it and letting it grow and the power of compound interest, they can have more than $250,000. And that can generate additional supplemental annual income of more than $14,000. Now, when you think of Social Security today on average, providing income somewhere in the range of $16,000 to $18,000, that makes a big difference for low and moderate income workers to be able to have that supplement to Social Security, to delay claiming their Social Security and be able to wait in order to increase their Social Security benefits. And then we've talked about the Savers Tax Credit, which is not effectively utilized today. And as part of Secure 2.0, the consideration of the Savers Tax Credit and also consideration of making it refundable. And we wanted to illustrate the benefit of the Savers Tax Credit. And if we do make it refundable, that would be enormous. The refundability and putting that money into people's retirement accounts, if we're doing that again in the same scenario, it significantly increases the growth of those contributions over time because of the refundability into those accounts and boosts that annual income by almost an additional 50% to more than $21,000 in additional income. This is from $100 a month in savings consistently over a working lifetime. And we know and we hope that if we give them the access, that they'll be able to save even more than that $100 a month over their career and can start those good savings behaviors. And these state programs are contributing to all of that. So again, I would direct people, if they're interested, to cri.georgetown.edu. We did break down in terms of the state benefits of expanding access. We show the demographic changes, as I mentioned, the aging of the population, the reduction in the dependency ratio, that is working households who can support aging households, the access gap in your state to understand how many workers lack access, how important it is to cover as many employers as possible. And as you can see on the right here in illustration, we show if workers are able to save, and it's tailored to the economy and what we know about workers in your state, what that can mean in terms of additional supplemental income over time. And then again, the significant economic and fiscal benefits. And as I wrap up, as we stay on this slide, a few things to just keep in mind and takeaways. As we think about these state programs and we think about the future of savings and hopefully, expanded national universal access, there are things that we'll continue to get better at and things that we will continue to think about. We need to be thinking about, again, efforts around financial education. There's a lot of effort and attention focused now on emergency savings and how we can help workers build emergency savings accounts, and by doing that, help to protect retirement savings over the long term. Lifetime income. At the end of the day, it's not just about savings, but we're only going to be successful if we help with the decumulation of those assets at the time of retirement. And how do we generate that into lifetime income to last a lifetime for workers? That's an important issue. It's something we're working on here in the center and many other people are working on. But when we look at the next generation of these programs, and it's also with respect to private sector and employer-sponsored plans, we need to get better at developing lifetime income solutions. Again, as I noted, we'll have more programs coming online. And again, in your states, please support these initiatives. We need that support. There are a number of other states that have been considering these state IRA programs. We'd like to see them successful. We don't know how quickly the federal government will act. If we had waited to not move these state programs, and NCPERS has been critical as a champion and moving these state programs forward in the absence of federal action, we wouldn't have more than 30,000 employers, more than 300,000 funded accounts, and more than $200 million of assets in those accounts. And we might as well keep going. And we hope the federal government will catch up and we'll have universal access. But in the meantime, we want to help as many workers as we can. And if we have to do it state by state, we can see it's going to change lives. So with that, again, thank you, Hank, and to NCPERS for the opportunity to share the story of what's happening in the states today.
Angela, thank you for that great presentation. It was really, truly uplifting and gives me a lot of hope. For folks who may not be aware, for NCPERS, we started down this road 10 years ago. We issued our Secure Choice Pension White Paper in September of 2011. And when we started sharing that document with people and organizations, there were instances where we literally got laughed out of the room. And in 10 short years, to see where we've come, it is just truly dramatic and uplifting. And Angela, I know you've had a big hand in making that happen over the last handful of years. You stood up CRI, you've been talking to states on a regular basis. The question for you is, given your depth and intimacy in this issue, have there been any surprises? And if so, what are they?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, I can't say that there really have been surprises. I think there's been, I think politically, this issue, as you said, started many years ago. NCPERS was part of that. The conceiving of this was a bipartisan effort many years ago, and it was originally envisioned as being a national effort. So that national universal access concept. And again, thankfully, states have moved these programs along so that we have tens of thousands of additional savers. What I'd like to see and what we continue to work so hard on, and for those in your audience that are listening again, please work with your state legislators, work with your congressional delegations, and encourage. There is tremendous bipartisan support generally for it. What we'd like to see is our actual legislators, both at the national level and at the state level, be working more in a bipartisan fashion to advance these programs. So, but again, I don't think in terms of surprises, I think it's only been pleasant surprises in what we've seen. And I think, again, now as thinking about it, is the extent to which the private sector has really, the states have helped to drive innovation. We've seen these programs and what we've learned with the power of auto enrollment and different tools to help people save, which now the private sector is adopting more in employer-sponsored plans. And at the same time, the private sector has also thought, gee, yeah, there's an access gap. We've kind of dropped the ball, but now we see the opportunity, and we want to also work hard to develop low-cost options that can reach more workers. And it's all good, because at the end of the day, we're focused on closing that access gap and getting workers to save. And it's a huge problem, and the states are always going to be a part of that. But the private sector has also recognized and sort of come along to see how powerful it is, and the fact that when given the opportunity, workers will want to save. And so now they're stepping up to try and reach more of their workers as well. So that has been a pleasant surprise that we've seen with the growing support for these state initiatives. And I hope that does translate into national universal access.
Angela, thank you again for your time. You've been very generous. This presentation, again, has been very uplifting and gives me a lot of hope. Thank you. And again, as I said with Kara and Tony, I look forward to being at your program in January of next year, and hopefully having you at our program later in January of 2022.
Again, Hank, I can't thank you enough, and to NCPERS and to everybody who's part of the NCPERS world, thank you so much for supporting these initiatives and allowing the Georgetown Center for Retirement initiatives to be part of this effort. It's changing lives. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good day. Take care. All right, now shifting back, we're going to hear from the White House. The Honorable Cedric Richmond was a member of the United States House of Representatives representing Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District. He assumed office on January 5th, 2011, and he left office January 15th, 2021. Mr. Richmond served as the chair and leading spokesman for the Congressional Black Caucus from November 2016 to December 2018. On November 17, 2020, President-elect Joe Biden announced that Cedric Richmond would join his administration as senior advisor to the president and director of the White House Office of Public Engagement. Please welcome Mr. Cedric Richmond.
Hello, NCPERS. I want to say a quick thank you to Executive Director Hank Kim and President Dan Fortuna for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And thanks to everyone here for the work you do. As the son of a public school teacher, I know firsthand what it means for our public employees to have the security of a stable pension fund. To the state and local staff, the trustees of the pension plans, you help provide our communities and public employees, the firefighters, teachers, and all other public workers with a pathway to a middle-class life. As the President says, middle-class wages and benefits are the backbone of our nation. I know the pandemic has made life challenging, and the impact on our economy has made your work more difficult. But all the more critical as millions of American working families rely on you to safeguard their ability to retire with dignity and respect. In return, you need a government who will support your efforts, which is why the President put forth one of the most ambitious legislative agendas in the history of our nation. A plan to address head-on the battle against the pandemic that will get our economy back on track for everyone. The American Rescue Plan helped provide critical funding needed for state and local governments. The President made a promise a long time ago to address the economic impact that COVID has on states and municipality funding streams, and he kept that promise with over $3.2 billion in state fiscal relief, $2 billion in local fiscal relief, and more than $2.7 billion in relief for our K-12 schools. But the American Rescue Plan does a lot more. It recognizes the fundamental and inherent dignity that comes with a stable retirement for American workers. When he signed the rescue plan into law, the President kept his promise to protect the millions of Americans who invested in their multi-employer pension plans, and in doing so, helped stabilize over 200 multi-employer pension plans teetering on the edge of financial disaster. Now, the President is proposing the most ambitious infrastructure initiative since the New Deal. The American Jobs Plan is a commitment to our investing in our infrastructure, from the care economy to our bridges and roads. At the end of the day, this means jobs, American jobs that provide a pathway to the middle class and, yes, a stable retirement. Along with the economic initiatives, the President is following through on his promise to help secure the nation's economy for all Americans, regardless of background, race, religion, or sexual orientation. We must recognize that racial disparities in our nation include the lack of diversity in the people who are managing our retirement benefits. Again, the President is following through on his promise to help secure the nation's economy, but we can't do it alone. We need your help to ensure a better nation for our children, so they too can realize the dream of a secure and dignified retirement. Thank you again for inviting me, and may God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond, for giving us an update from the administration standpoint. Now is the time to honor our 2020 NCPERS Policymaker of the Year Award recipient. A lifelong Ohioan, Senator Sherrod Brown has spent his career fighting for the dignity of work, the idea that hard work should pay off for everyone, no matter who you are, where you live, or what kind of work you do. Senator Brown serves as chairman of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. He also serves on the Finance Committee, the Agriculture Committee, and is the longest-serving Ohioan on the Veterans Affairs Committee. We are honoring Senator Brown today as the NCPERS 2020 Policymaker of the Year for his tireless efforts to reform and streamline the administration of Internal Revenue Code Section 402L, also known as the health provision, and early Medicare buy-in for public safety retirees. While Senator Brown couldn't join us in person, he has supplied us with a short recording to accept his award.
I'm Sherrod Brown. Thank you to the National Conference on Public Employees Retirement Systems for honoring me today. But more important, thank you for your work on behalf of all workers and retirees across the country who have earned pensions. The millions of workers you represent understand collective bargaining. They gave up dollars today to put it aside for their future and the promises of a secure retirement. After a lifetime of hard work in service to our country, our teachers, our firefighters, our children's workers, our law enforcement, public servants all should be able to retire with the dignity they have earned. But their retirement security is under constant threat from greedy corporations and politicians who don't understand collective bargaining, don't understand that a pension is a promise, don't understand the sacrifices you make at the bargaining table today or in the workplace today for your future. When Wall Street gambled and lost, they got a bailout. When big corporations come to Washington looking for tax cuts, they get a handout. Workers never ask for either, just what they have earned. We know that supporting pensions just doesn't affect you. These dollars are going right back into supporting the economy. Most people who get public employee pensions, most PERS or STRS or SERS members in Ohio aren't putting their money in a Swiss bank account. They're spending it in Lima and Cleveland and Dayton and Springfield and Gallipolis. So I'll continue leading in efforts in Washington to improve retirement security. I'm introducing bipartisan legislation later this week to repeal the windfall elimination provision in the government pension offset that hurt public sector workers. Employees who work hard, who follow the rules, should not be penalized with lower benefits because of earned pension income. I'm committed to continuing our fight together to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Your advocacy on those issues matter greatly too. I won't stop fighting until we protect the retirement security that all workers have earned. Thank you for speaking out.
Thank you, Senator Brown, for your championing of our issues and your leadership in the retirement space. We're so fortunate to have someone like you as an ally in the United States Senate and other members of Congress who support public sector pension plans. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a very eventful and compact 2 hours. Certainly a little different than our typical legislative conference, but as I said in the beginning, we all have to adapt and we all have to adjust in the COVID reality that we're in. Hopefully we're at the tail end of this, and as I alluded to at the beginning, that maybe this might be one of the last virtual or remote programs that you'll participate in from your computer, and that sometime in the very near future that we'll be able to gather in person and together to socialize, learn, and network. From our NCPERS perspective, we feel that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, with the vaccination progressing as fast as it has, that our future programs, the last two for the calendar year, can be held in person. So we are planning the Public Pension Funding Forum scheduled for August 22nd through the 24th in New York City. It's going to be held, as I said, in late August. We think that by that point, enough individuals will be vaccinated, and that with, again, social distancing and safety measures in place, that we can host an effective and safe program for the Public Pension Funding Forum. And then to round out the year, we will be hosting our fall program, standing for Financial, Actuarial, Legislative, and Legal program, September 26th through the 28th, currently scheduled for Scottsdale, Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your support through these incredibly trying times. At NCPERS, we do value your membership, we do value your participation, and thank you for staying with us and supporting us through the past year and for the past nearly 80 years that NCPERS has been in existence. Thank you so much. Have a good balance of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next program.